Hello, my name is Elliot Cornett, and this is my presentation on Walking in Crime, Insights from Walkability and Safety Data. So for the first part, I'm going to talk about the process that I used from going from part 2 to part 3, or from phase 2 to phase 3 of this project, and how I had to get all of my data together to actually analyze it. So during phase 2 of the project, I just got my data from sources online and cleaned it. But for part 3, I actually needed to put it together. So I concatenated two of my data sets, and I wrote a function that combined all of the data from my downloaded walkability index with all of the data from my FBI from the FBI website that I had web scraped. However, this was challenging because the FBI data was organized by metropolitan area, and the other in my downloaded data set was organized by combined statistical area, which can be comprised of 2 to 3 metropolitan areas. So the way that I combated this was by implementing a data frame that I used in phase 2 that contained every combined statistical area and the metropolitan areas that were constituents of that combined area. I then turned that data frame into a dictionary that I mapped onto my original data frame to give every single FBI crime statistic a value for their combined statistical area. I then grouped all of the FBI data by that combined statistical area and merged the two data frames together on the CSA column. So I think it makes more sense for my project to show you guys some of the visualizations of my data before getting into some of the insights that I learned. So the first part of this is the crime rates overall versus walkability. You can see in red is the violent crime and blue is the property crime that was reported. And the crime rates on the y-axis are per 100,000 inhabitants. So these are rates of the population, not just total crime in general. And then on the x-axis, you have the walkability index of each of these cities. And then the size of each of the points represents the population of the city. As you can see, there isn't really a major correlation, positive or negative, between crime rate and walkability. It's kind of just flat across the board, which is a common theme that you'll see throughout the rest of this project. The only pattern that we can kind of see is that the more populous cities drift more towards the right, so having higher walkability, which isn't a surprise at all. I mean, we know that as cities grow and develop, city leaders will often implement more and more pedestrian-oriented design and just public transportation in general. So this is the violent crime data mapped per individual crime. So as you can see, we have murder, rape, robbery, and aggravated assault. And for each of these individual crimes, there still isn't much of a correlation. You can see there's a slight positive correlation between robbery and walkability. So robbery does slightly improve as cities become more walkable. But overall, there isn't any statistically significant correlation between these two factors for any of the violent crimes. However, it is interesting to see the spread of these crimes between different cities, and how aggravated assault, for example, is so much more spread out because they are so much more common than murders, for example. And here are the same crime reportings for burglary, larceny, theft, and motor vehicle theft, the property crimes that were listed by the FBI nationally. As you can see, same story. None of them really have positive or negative correlations at all. But you can see that larceny theft is the most common of these property crimes and has the most spread rates, has the highest range of rates throughout all the cities that I measured. So part 3, here's some of the insights that I dug into in my project. So first of all, I wanted to test for thresholds. So I wanted to see if there was a walkability threshold at which it was worth it for a city to invest in their walkability. And if there was a point at which implementing more walkability is either ineffective or even increases violent crime. So I tested each of the 4 subsets of violent crime at each individual walkability index, so 0 all the way to 12. However, throughout all of this data, I found little to no correlation between walkability and any violent crime, and no actual thresholds are found. It kind of just seemed to be flat across the whole board. So second, I wanted to see if by dividing combined statistical areas by population, I could find some sort of pattern. However, when I set up my cities, I ended up finding that the correlation was negligible. As you can see in this graph, I divided each of the combined statistical areas into 5 different population groups, those being very low, low, medium, high, and very high. And the edges of these bins were determined by a small algorithm that I wrote that determines it determines the quintiles of the population data and sets the edges of the bins accordingly. So each of the bins have the same number of cities in them. So here's the graph for the violent crime and walkability. As you can see, none of the correlations get any further than around 0.18 in magnitude, which is no correlation at all. And then here is the same graph for property crimes. As you can see, the spread is a little bit higher. So we have, for very high populated cities, there is a very, very slight correlation in having a very slight positive correlation in walkability and property crime. So that actually indicates that for cities of very high population, that is cities over, I believe, around 5 million in population, the property crime actually increases for cities that are more walkable. And the last thing I tested is walkability and employment. So I wanted to see if there was a correlation between the walkability of the city and how easily people are getting employed in that city. And as you can see, no such correlation exists once again. So in conclusion, while the results of my simple data analysis study would suggest that cities should just disregard walkability entirely when attempting to reduce crime, there are many more variables that could be considered, and walkability should obviously be continuously studied for its effect on the population of a city, especially in regard to the city's overall happiness and quality of life. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope you have a wonderful day.